I'm Rich Borden, and I'm going to try to follow up a little bit on what John Anderson was talking about last week. And before I go on, is the sound okay? Is it clear? Is it good enough? All right. And what I'm going to do is show some pictures and tell a few stories and read a few things and raise some questions and try to keep the ball rolling in the direction that I think we're trying to go in. And when you get into the interdisciplinary realm, the language starts to get a little odd sounding, and you end up with words like biochemistry or political economics or behavioral genetics or biogeochemistry, because it's people trying to put things back together that have been apart. And human ecology is one of those terms, probably one of the bigger of those terms. They're trying to put together things from across a lot of different backgrounds. And John gave a nice history of natural history last time. I hoped he might have gone a little bit further and gone into a little bit more of the history of ecology, which is a very big topic by itself. So I'm just going to do a snapshot on that piece and then do a little bit more narrow tracks of trying to piece things together. But ecology sort of hatched itself in the late 1800s, early 1900s as sort of the first really big interdisciplinary science. Because to understand what ecology was trying to get at, and what it was really trying to get at was what John was talking about. It was trying to get at natural history. But it was trying not to just to name the things that are out there, but start to look at the actual relationships among them. And that's what ecology became. And when you started to look at the interactions among living things and their relationship to their environment, their physical environment, you had to bring together the physical and the biological sciences. You had to bring together hydrology and meteorology, and you had to bring in chemistry and physics, but you also had to bring in botany, you had to bring in physiology, animal behavior, and all those kinds of things. So it became a true interdisciplinary science that developed itself pretty well and developed a lot of theoretical ideas along with just doing research over a couple of decades. And as it did that, it created its own language. And that language, I won't go into it in any detail, but it had to do with the way in which organisms form relationships and how you describe those relationships and how those relationships change. And that language became interesting to people in the various human studies. Sociologists got very interested in some of those ideas because they were looking at the way in which society forms its relationships, sort of analogous to the way the rest of the living world, the natural world, did. And the anthropologists got interested in it as a way to look at culture, and geographers got interested in it. It gradually moved its way across virtually all of the disciplines, that some bits of ecology started to be borrowed by or adopted into various disciplines. And then later on, and you're starting to get into some of this in the readings that I had you look at, the Paul Shepard and the Paul Sears, and even some of the ones that we've written here, at some point it stopped being ecology in other disciplines, and it turned itself inside out, and the disciplines, if you will, started to come inside of ecology. And that's sort of when you get this bigger version of human ecology along the lines of what we're doing, okay? So that's a quick, sketch across that. And what I'm going to try to do is dissect some more specific paths through all of it that are a little closer to what we've been reading, and particularly ideas that come from Isley and ideas that come from some of the papers that we've been looking at lately. And so as a sort of an outline, I want to take these, I'll say convergent paths, one that follows sort of an evolutionary line that goes through time, another one that goes not so much through time, but through mind, and looking, if you will, my background is psychology, to look at some of the psychological dimensions of what draw into human ecology. And then maybe as the third theme there, looking at them when you start to put them together, what happens when you start to mix the mental and the environmental. And then finally come to, I hope, some kind of loose closure and reveal to you my current thinking. Because some of you, maybe all of you, have read a human ecology essay I wrote many years ago. And I don't think exactly the same way anymore. And so I'm going to try to divulge a little bit of where I am Now, to make a long story very short, Isley makes a distinction between the first world and the second world. By the first world, he's talking about the world of nature. In the second world, he's talking about the world of the mind. So if we look at the major bus stops along the way in the first world before the dawn of humanity, it looks like the origins of life as we understand it, as being able to reproduce itself, started about 4.5 billion years ago with a bunch of little anaerobic bacteria-like organisms that reproduced asexually and sort of were squirting around, tiny little bags of chemicals that were able to reproduce themselves. And in 1 billion or so years, they figured out how to get more involved with each other, actually how to eat each other, and how to incorporate parts of one another into each other and become more complicated organisms. And that from those come what are called the eukaryote or the nucleated cells, larger, more complicated. I was about to say the word death, and it just happened. Okay, there we go. And the eukaryotes did a lot of things. One thing they did was very important was they invented sex. And so that instead of it being simple budding or fission as the way that they reproduce themselves, they ended up figuring out how to send a code forward to the next generation in DNA, and that's sort of the story of sex. They also, when they did that, invented death, and they invented a number of other kinds of things, including early multicellular forms and so on. As we follow down along, sort of in the mid-early Cambrian, we start to find organisms that have backbones. These are obviously part of our ancestral line. And after a period of time, another 100 or so million years, they figured out how to, or they start to emerge with hands and feet, and with the tetrapods. And sometime later on, the eggs turn into live birth, and we start to see the mammals coming forward. And then there was a few of the very early mammal primates sort of squeaked through the Cretaceous extinction 65 million years ago. And are, at that point, the people that we were talking about, our sort of lineage, were small, nocturnal insectivores that lived in trees and ate insects. By 15 million years ago, the primates had elaborated themselves into the major families of the great apes, of which we are a part. And this is where we start to enter what Isley's calling the second world. The first Homo genus of which we are a part emerges more or less 2.5 billion years ago, of which there may be as many as 10 species of Homo. You've heard of, I assume some of these, certainly you've heard of Neanderthal or perhaps Erectus or habilis. Many of these lived side by side for a long period of time. Out of them emerged Homo sapiens, sort of our storyline, maybe 400,000 years ago, more or less. And of those, a small number moved out of Africa, maybe 65,000 years ago, and started to spread around the globe. The last Neanderthal, the last other Homo species to live alongside Homo sapiens appears to have disappeared maybe 25 or 30,000 years ago in Europe. And I'm going to read a few things from time to time along here because it's more efficient than because I get myself off into these other lines. So when the first band of hunter-gatherers emigrated out of Africa 65,000 years ago, they were just a few hundred strong. It took all of human history from then up to 1800 for the population to reach its first billion. The second billion took only until 1930. A mere 3/4 of a century later, there are well beyond 6 billion human inhabitants on the planet, and it is estimated that 1/10 of all people who ever lived are alive today. When Homo sapiens emigrated out of Africa, they spread in all directions, first into the Eurasian continent, across Southeast Asia, and then on to New Guinea and Australia, arriving there about 40,000 years ago. The migration from Asia to North America, and thereafter South America, would come later, somewhere between 13 and 11,000 years ago. Humans were truly a global species by then, living in a multitude of diverse environments. what I'm doing here is I'm trying to get that picture, that evolutionary picture that Isley is talking about, get it sort of condensed down so we can get it into our heads. And last summer, my sister and I, it's a long story, I can't go into it, but it was her high school reunion, and I went with it, and we went back and saw where we grew up and did all those sorts of things. And when it was all over, I went back to her house, and we sat there, and we got one of those National Geographic genographic kits where you can send your DNA in, and it will trace you back to way back. So I gave my Y chromosome, which she doesn't have, and she gave her mitochondria, which I do have, but I let her do it. And a month later, the results came back. And this is the map. You know, we were kind of curious, so what was the storyline? What was going on there? So my Y chromosome, if you want to trace it back there, goes back through those various mutations all the way back to who the person they're now calling chromosomal Y Adam, somewhere way back there, of which, frankly, all of us are descendants here. And on our mitochondrial DNA, the map goes back, haplogroup H. You see the various mutations that were picked up along the way, and we all go, and all the rest of us go back to this, what they think, or what they call mitochondrial Eve, right? What I'm really trying to get at there is that I want to get these things into my experience. And this is one way that now, as we learn more and more, we really can bring them into our experience because, and let me put it a different way, because Isley plays with this. He's always playing with that kind of time in his essays. And it's sort of like, okay, I look at this and my sister and I share something that goes way, way back. But so do we. All of us have this, pretty much the same story. It may have gone on in different ways around the world, but believe me, it all, as far as I can tell, started out in Africa, and we've got that. And if you want to go a little bit further, you can pick up a toad and kiss the toad if you want, and then thank the toad for your arms and legs, because you'll see them in there. Or you can go out and hug a tree if you want. And if you shake the tree a little bit, the truth is your DNA strings go way, 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 way back to those early prokaryote cells and stuff. We are, as Darwin said, all netted together. But one thing I'm interested in is how do we get that into our actual consciousness? So another way to look at, let's say, some of the origins is to look at it from the point of view of consciousness. And when I was in your place, a first-year student in college, one of the books I read in my first term was a book by S.I. Hayakawa called Language and Thought in Action. And it really startled me because it showed me, it brought into my awareness some things about thought and language that I did not have categories for until then. And what Hayakawa outlined, this is a long book and it's longer than I'm making it very simple, was that there are levels of abstraction in the way we think and in the way we speak. And if we just talk about language for the moment, sometimes language is very concrete. It is very specific. It's not a joke. It's not poetry. The word means what it's pointing to, and it's usually pointing to a thing. So if you take the owner's manual out of the glove compartment of your car, that's a good example of it. The lug wrench is the lug wrench, right? The tire is the tire. The jack is the jack, right? It's very straight. It's about those things, and that language is to try to put those things together in some kind of a meaning structure. Language can, when it gets a little bit more abstract, it's not just talking about the things, it's talking about the relationship between the things, right? It's looking at the interactions of stuff. It's sort of like if you watch people at the side of a tennis court when a tennis game is going on, that they're doing this back and forth. They're watching the ball, they're not watching the players, they're actually watching the game. They're looking at the interaction somehow or other. And that's true in language too. If you are overhearing or just listening to someone talk about how their date went last night, they're going to be talking to you in a relational kind of language, and it's a bit more abstract. It's got different kinds of terminology in it than just the names of things. You're really starting to talk about the names of processes or interactions. And at the higher level, or maybe even at the highest level, Hayakawa puts out there was that when we talk about the relationship of relationships, we have entered the realm of what he calls ideas. And so maybe Bill Carpenter's essay is a good example of it. Bill Carpenter in that essay talks about the relationship between science and art. And he's got into a very complicated idea space there with that little essay of his. Or we could talk about the relationship between truth and beauty, which is sort of like what he's talking about. Or you could talk about the relationship between freedom and responsibility. That's when we're getting into the realm of ideas. And again, to draw on one of the essays that we've been looking at, if you've read, have all of you read John Visvader's piece there? Where he's talking about mapping, going across maps, where this map maps onto that map and how to make those connections. He's talking about the interdisciplinary space where what we know on this plane of knowledge can be connected up in a certain way, but not completely, to the next, a different plane of knowledge and so on. And he's talking about the way in which interdisciplinary thought might go together, which is very much like what Hayakawa's professor, his dissertation advisor, whose name was Korzybski, Alfred Korzybski developed a field known as general semantics. And this is just about how knowledge goes together and how language works. But he coined a very important phrase, and you've probably all heard it, which is the map is not the territory. And a lot of what we're talking about when we are in the academic world, or even in ordinary life, what we're trying to do is how to make sense out of reality, which is very complicated. So we make up descriptions or we make up maps. And what he's saying is that don't confuse the map with reality, which happens for a lot of people. Not that people confuse the menu with the food and eat the menu, but that these are different kinds of ways of putting things together. And that there are more or less good maps. And I think on the long term, in the big picture of what we're trying to get at here with this interdisciplinary quest we're on, is trying to get better and better maps, or find better and better ways to put together the maps of what we think we know. So, John was talking about, he started, I think, off in a psychology class, and he ended up falling in love with birds. I think I started off in a biology class and fell in love with people. And there was something in Korzybski, there's something in Hayakawa that for me was very much like what was in biology, like a botanist. If you ever go out with an ornithologist, they'll drive you crazy because they're always, what's that? They're always looking at where the birds are because they can't not watch the birds. Or even botanists are that way. Botanists go out and they fall down on their knees and they're looking at this and that. That kind of stuff. That's what happened to me with people. People became that kind of interesting to me. And what I was looking for was the patterns, not of their body, but of their mind. And this is what got me into psychology. I was really interested in the patterns and the connections between how people thought, how to describe how they thought, how thought connected to feeling, and so on and so on. So let me give you an example. If I wanted to say to you, be careful, I could say that in a lot of different kinds of ways. Or let me turn it around. Here's some of the ways in which someone could say to you, be careful. Anybody here fly in through Detroit? You came in through Detroit. Anybody else? Did you have to change terminals in Detroit? Okay, you know the Detroit airport? If you haven't been to the Detroit airport, it's an absolute trip to go there. They've got this underground tunnel that's very long, and it's all glass. And when you go through it, there's these tinkling music, and the lights are changing, and all. And there's these long, what do you call those things? Moving walkways, and you have to get on them, and halfway, they can't make them long enough, so you have to get off and get on. And the Detroit airport is just filled with these moving walkways. Well, as you come through the end of the moving walkway, there's a tape recorder that says over and over and over. It says, watch your step as you exit the moving walkway. Watch your step as you exit the moving walkway. Okay, so that's one way to say, be careful. Another way to say be careful, if you're in England, if you've seen this one, is mind the gap. Anybody seen this one? You know what its point, it became a big deal. I mean, I think they nationalized it in Britain, and I think they sold it to every subway in the world. Because now wherever you go, they think they did it in 1969, and ever since, there's another one of these obnoxious, repetitive things, mind the gap, mind the gap. And it's talking about when you get off these little things, okay? So that's sort of, you feel the difference between them a little bit, right? Certainly the language is different, but where it points is a little bit different. And when Anderson and I were in China a couple of years ago, I don't know where we were going somewhere. And we might have been in the Forbidden City or someplace, but there was a staircase or there was someplace where they were trying to say to us, be careful. But they translated the Chinese phrase into English, and here's what the English phrase was. I really loved it. Bring your feet into awareness. You know, it's like a yoga instructor, you know? It's like, now scan your body and that sort of. Well, this is what I'm talking about in a way. I'm talking about bringing what we're trying to get at here into awareness somehow or other. And so while we're talking about awareness, to reflect again, when I was about this moment in your college experience in my freshman year, I was in my dormitory room, and somebody came running down the hall and said, the president has been shot in Dallas. And I thought, Jesus, who would shoot the university president? That was my first thought. And because I had no idea that Kennedy was in Dallas at that moment in time. And it was cleared up pretty quickly. But that moment in time, the day Kennedy was shot, was one of those events for those who lived through it that they call flashbulb memories, or it does something in awareness and it really sticks in awareness. You know what I'm talking about? None of you were there then, but all of you, I think, were somewhere on 9/11. And do you remember where you were? What school? What grade were you in? Third or fourth grade? How did they handle that for you? Did it have a dramatic impact on you? Is that one of those things for you all? Okay. I've been thinking about this lately in other kinds of ways, because these are shared experiences that people really have. I mean, when it happens, it happens. And if it happens, it's like punctuates history in a meaningful kind of way. But I'm trying to think, between 9/11, that's 10 years ago exactly, right? Between then and now, have we had another one that has brought us all together like that? What? Obama's election? Would that qualify? I wonder, that seems like it's sort of on the edge of that. And also, you were probably protected a little bit more if you were in third or fourth grade by somebody. But did Michael Jackson, does he count? That was one loud no. I don't want to be overwhelmed by one loud no. Michael Jackson isn't going to pull it off? Okay, well, never mind, I don't care. Let me turn that inside out or turn it the other way, because this is where I'm really trying to go with it in another way. And this may be a class assignment in some of your sections. I hope it is. Whether or not we all share the same moment somehow or other, we all have our moments that are really significant life experiences that have that kind of impact on us alone, or maybe you and a few other people. And those in psychology are very important. Those are often moments of real insight, and they can be really life-changing. Abraham Maslow and others in certain parts of psychology call those peak experiences. And what I am interested in, as a psychologist, and I've been interested in this for a long time, is what are the peak experiences that we have as individuals or as society, but as individuals, that punctuate our lives or really change the way we look at the living world. And some people call those environmental insights or ecological insights or things like that. But if you have a chance, I don't know if in yours, I will do this in my section for sure. I would like to have people try to remember one of those events in your own personal life that somehow or other gave you a sense of meaningful connection to the living world. Do you see what I'm getting at? Okay. I'm not going to go any further with that because that's something I'll play with later on in a different context. So where are we? Next one. Oh, I didn't talk about this. Let me add this one in because I like it, which is not the only criteria for it to be here. But I don't know if any of you have ever heard of Noam Chomsky. Anybody heard of Noam Chomsky? You sort of know who okay. Chomsky was a really important person because it was believed for a long time and promulgated by a sort of heavy-handed behaviorist psychologist by the name of B.F. Skinner, that we learn everything within our lifetime. And what Chomsky came out with was the idea that no, we don't learn everything in our lifetime. And in particular, he believed, and has demonstrated, I think, pretty credibly, that we have a structure, we have a language capacity already built into us. We're prepared for learning language. We learn the particular language, but the equipment, or whatever you say, the mind processes to be able to learn language is there. And along those lines, there's an anthropologist, Roy Rappaport, whose work I've liked over the years. And I was in fact, the paper you just read that I wrote, the human ecology thing, he was on the same panel with me that day. And this is something he said there. He said this and that, but this is in other places in his work. He said, languages all seem to have within them the capacity for people to say what is, that is to describe things that are around them presently, the here and now. They have a language capacity to talk about what was, what we would call the past tense. That is the way to reconstruct memory and history within language. They have a way to talk about the future in a couple of ways. One is just what could be, that is the possibility of what might happen, or the imaginal world, the possible future. But we also have within that the way in which our values connect to the possible and add beyond just what is possible in terms of a language of what should be. We have a moral language, and it's built into us somehow or other. And what his point was that he, at least, has never seen a culture that doesn't have these features within it. And there is the language of the evaluation of the sense of what is good or bad or right or wrong. And as a psychologist, I could go into a lot more of how that is really deeply embedded in us. And the truth is we can hardly think without that as part of our mental processes. And finally, he threw another one on, which I thought was really important, which is that we also have the capacity to talk about that which never will be again. And you can frame that in a lot of ways, but what I think he's really talking about is human beings have death awareness. Somewhere around 6 or 7 years old, it comes upon you, and this may be one of those insights that you have. You realize, uh-oh, I'm going to die, right? And once you have that thought, it's like somebody tells you there's no Santa Claus. I hope I didn't break anybody's story up here. Once it's broken, it's over. And so he's talking about that. And this also goes into the fact that we may be one of the only organisms that can intentionally kill ourselves, and so on. So this is somehow or other built into all of this. And I would add on that last one, believe me, there are plenty of psychological defenses wrapped around that. So the third string through this is really to sort of put these all together and focus or emphasize what you are reading right now, essays, and to look at people who have tried to put something around the idea of human ecology, tried to, in language, in thought, say something about how the world is, how the world was, how the world could be, how the world should be. And that's what you've been reading right now. And it's to do the best you can to connect the facts, but in addition to that, also bring in values, your values or values that are of question or value questions around the facts, and put that together as a story or put that together as an essay. And the broad language of that, actually this idea comes from the founding president of this college who preferred not to talk about human ecology as a discipline or as the new science or the new anything like that, but rather as a perspective or as a way of looking at the world. And that collection of essays, if you read them or if you read them all together, those are very different sort of ways of looking at things. But if you stand back one more step or two steps, you generalize that and you're starting to get the perspective of what does that mean to put the relationship between humans and the living world together in a vision somehow or other. And then how about if you want to do it for yourself? Any questions before I go turn the corner? We okay? Okay. So, how do I do this part? I'm wearing this jacket for the next part of this talk because I have to do the next part in character. And the person I'm going to play is me. But it's a me that most of you guys don't see very often. And last month I was in Austin, Texas. And it was the annual meeting of the Ecological Society of America. And the Ecological Society of America is starting to get itself interested in human ecology in addition to all that natural ecology stuff. And I was part of a symposium and was invited to, whatever, give my thoughts about human ecology in this room with a bunch of people. And I could not hide, and I cannot hide the fact that I'm a psychologist. I mean, I really stand out in the Ecological Society of America. Those people, everywhere they go, they're wearing binoculars. I mean, it's pretty hard. If I go to a conference full of lawyers, or if I go to a conference full of economists, or if I go through a conference of artists, or if I go through, you know, these people look different. They do. And so, you know, I don't look, I mean, I could fake it a little bit, but the biologists try to look like biologists, and psychologists try to look like psychologists. Whatever, I'm a psychologist. And so what they asked me for is not my thoughts on the biology, they asked me my psychological thoughts on what is going on here. So, and they gave me a title, and the title was something about the good life. The guy says, hey, Rich, can you put something around the good life? You know, from a psychological point of view, and I said, sure, I can talk about anything from a psychological point of view. So but then it put me on the spot because I've got to figure out what could this mean, and what can I say to a group like that that's going to be of any interest whatsoever. So what I'm going to do is, I suppose this would be my most recent human ecology essay. And so, to play it straight, I'm going to read the first 2 pages. You know, I'll let it loose after that, but just to show you that I really do these things. Okay, it's okay? All right. Here we go. It has been said that the range of human concerns is framed by 2 basic questions. What makes life possible, and what makes life worth living? Between these bounds lie the innumerable ideas and queries that have occupied human thought over the ages. Like all generations, we share in these essential questions as we face the problems of our time. Unlike previous generations, we are also challenged by additional perplexities. I have a firm belief in the powers of insight. Some insights arise from within as deeply subjective transformations of inner experience. These events are part of the central subject matter of psychology. A different rendering of insight is aroused by external sources. This happens when the outside world presents us with new or contradictory information. The fundamental core of science is built upon investigation and systematic integration of knowledge from this realm. Subjective introspection is often viewed as complementary to or a reversal of objective scientific methods. The apparent incompatibility of these approaches has produced a long-standing tradition of keeping them relatively independent of one another. Yet we know, irrespective of how firmly we seek to draw a dividing line, they are intimately intertwined. As Paul Shepard put it, the central problem of human ecology may be characterized as the relationship of the mind to nature. One way to encourage integration is to place ideas in juxtaposition. Artists and poets commonly employ this device as a means to surmount the powers of rationalization. Psychotherapists also take advantage of analogical resemblance to uncover partial aspects of linked experience. Metaphorical extension invites unanticipated connections. It is an effective way to resolve our tendencies to compartmentalize feelings, thoughts, and perception. Scientists, as a rule, prefer a more reasoned order of relations and tend to be more critically minded. They are wary of falling prey to false analogies or being distracted by them. Their way of analyzing and integrating knowledge seeks more logical explanations, disembedded from mere likenesses. Yet a careful study of the history of science shows that metaphor and analogy have often been some of the most powerful tools of scientific creativity. Now, I'll stop here for a second. It was sort of cool for me there because I actually went to school at the University of Texas, which was there. And so I'll give you a little piece of my background. I went to school there. I thought I was going to be a biologist. Didn't work out. Became a psychologist, and I went off to graduate school at Kent and did a doctorate in personality and psychotherapy. After that, I started to get interested in the environment, and I didn't know what it meant, and so I did a postdoc in animal behavior and ecology at Ohio State. I was on the faculty there for a short time, and then after that, joined the faculty at Purdue, where I was lucky enough to be involved with a group of people that started one of the first environmental psychology programs. And then in the mix of that, I got interested in, okay, if I'm going to study this ecological consciousness or whatever it is, I got to go find some of it. And I found this little college on the coast of Maine, and I came up here with my graduate students and studied these people. And it went pretty well, and it was a lot of fun. And after a while, I thought it would be more fun not to study it, but to actually be here and do it. So I came here, got on the faculty, and I was an academic dean for a very long time here, and also did a lot of international networking on human ecology all around the world, and organized that kind of stuff. And a couple of years ago with John, we started the Human Ecology section in the Ecological Society of America. So that's sort of a quick background around that. So there's a piece of me, it doesn't live in Bar Harbor, but it's lived in my past lives where I was fairly serious about what I did. And some of those people that were there expected me to be that person. So I gave them a little taste of it. This is as far as I got. All right, it's not long. But this ties together some of the reasons why I was supposed to be doing what I was doing there. It goes like this. When ecological ideas entered public consciousness a half-century ago, issues of pollution, technology, and exponential population growth framed a sobering question. Can the natural environment absorb the impact of human influence? Between then and now, a gradual reframing has emerged, namely, can human consciousness comprehend our relation to the living world? This shift from a carrying capacity to a consciousness capacity perspective has been a beacon for many social scientists, from sociology and psychology to history, economics, and political ecology. The literature on environmental attitudes and behavior has become a vast multidisciplinary landscape. Social science has done a good job of exploring where these changes are happening, of discovering some of the antecedents and consequences of them, as well as identifying various obstacles to the development of ecological concern. Topics range from individual-level studies of attitudes, values, and belief systems to household-level models of conservation and decision-making, all the way to broad-based socio-demographic and cross-national comparisons. These studies reveal important findings at all levels. First, people do hold core value orientations that are characteristically egoistic or social altruistic, or less commonly ecologically and biospheric centered. Second, those values and associated attitudes significantly influence environmentally responsible behavior. Third, a substantial level of ecological impact is also associated with family choices and household actions, and broader still. And finally, when basic levels of food, shelter, and material affluence are met, it appears that a post-material orientation may emerge across diverse social and national contexts with positive pro-environmental consequences. The list goes on, but the point is clear. Environmental knowledge and beliefs are important components of a sustainability transition. Their dimensions are woven throughout the processes of change at societal, economic, and policy levels. But here is the human ecological but clause. There is a big difference between exploring natural systems or studying minds that are changing and the creative processes of human consciousness involved in the actual changing of minds. Again, as Paul Shepard reminds us, ecological science can probably inform us of what will happen if the forest is cut down, but whether it will be cut or conserved is a human ecological question. Does that sound okay? Sounds like I know what I'm doing. Well, that's as good as it gets, because I couldn't go anywhere. Something happened to me there, and I'll tell you what happened, and this is the truth. I got distracted by two things. I was trying to write this rather serious paper, and then, I don't know, I was in my seminar last spring, my human ecology seminar, and a student came in, River Black, some of you may know her, and she had just discovered this little tool on Google called Engrams. Any of you know what it is? Any of you come across it yet? Engrams. Letter N, grams. Okay. What it is that Google is electronically scanning the books that have been written. They've so far scanned 5 million books over the last 400, 500 years. So you have all these words in a heap that you can then go in and Google a word and see how the word has been used over long periods of time. You got me? Okay. And so we decided to play around with it, and I won't go into this at great length, but take two rather common words from ecology, like niche. And there is the frequency. I didn't put the actual numbers on, they don't mean anything. That's the shape of the interest around the word niche from, say, 1960 up through 2000. And this, John can fill you in with the history of, Gleason and, all the people that added to this in different kinds of ways. But they brought that word into language. Actually, the word had been in language for a long time. Niche has special meaning. Louisa Mays Alcott used it all the way back in Little Women. And it's got a religious meaning about, where niches are, where you put icons on the side and stuff. I won't go into that. So it's got a history, but it shows it had a history, but it got a boost. Ecosystem didn't have a history. It came in and sort of took over ecology and became sort of a key term for a long period of time. So this got me really distracted. I mean, I stayed up late at night, too long, playing with this in different kinds of ways. And I figured, well, if these people want me to talk about the good life, what is the good life? So I decided to take a look at the word good life. It turns out the word good life wasn't used much before 1900, and it really came into currency during the Depression era, and it's particularly associated, and there's ways to burrow down in this, it became particularly associated with a couple of people. If you've ever heard of Helen and Scott Nearing, these were people who were sort of the first pioneers of the Back to the Land movement in the 30s and 40s. Helen wrote a couple of very important books called, what is it called? Getting the Good Life? Making the Good Life? The Good Life. The Good Life, yeah, it's simpler. And that's a long story there, but that phrase sort of came in, and that was a group of people that I was interested in doing research on for a number of years, and I did chase these people. Some of your parents may be these people that dropped out and went to Vermont and went to Maine, all the sort of ones that, how many of you have these parents or back to the landers? A few of you anyhow? Okay. Good, I'm glad. And I used to, that interested me, and underneath that was something else, a movement that happened, a later movement called the Voluntary Simplicity Movement. Have you heard of this? In 1970, a guy at the Stanford Research Institute by the name of Dwayne Elgin wrote a book called Voluntary Simplicity, and it was by far the most widely used, cited, or requested research report ever published by Stanford Research Institute, Voluntary Simplicity. I used it. I actually taught a course here years ago called Voluntary Simplicity. It was sort of a popular course, and it's still going on, but it's not so much going back to the land now. It's more like urban, did I lose the sound there? More like urban voluntary simplicity, and that movement's still going on. So that gave me a new angle, or a new way to look at what my assigned task right there. By the way, I can take half a minute here to ask you. I also Googled sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Who do you think is the winner? Sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Huh? Okay, who's the loser? Which one's and there's a big difference here. Which one's used the least? You got it, guys. You're right on. All right, rock and roll is way down there, but sex and drugs, I'm telling you, they've been around for a long time and really strong. Way before rock and roll. So, and here's the second thing that distracted me. This is a book by, actually, he's a trustee of the College of the Atlantic, David Hackett Fisher. Got the Pulitzer Prize for some of his historical writing. And a couple of years ago, in this room, he was giving a talk about this book when it had just come out. And at the end of the talk, I sort of blithely, naively raised my hand and I said, David, how come you didn't put democracy in the title? And he said to me, well, Rich, nobody talked about democracy back then. And I said, well, he's a historian, it might be true. And I didn't think about it, but then when this Google thing came along, I said, let's take a peek at that. So here's the story, and he's right. Liberty was a very popular word around the time of the American Revolution. It was the watchword, and it also had its impact on the French Revolution, if you know how their story went. And I went a little bit further. Okay, here's freedom. You see freedom there underneath the green line? Not as big, but it rises up at about the same time. It's holding on still pretty long. Democracy wasn't even in the world as a term. Very, very rare. But if we go a little bit further down, you look at democracy after 1800, you find two big peaks. Democracy was the word around the time of World War I and World War II. So, I think that's sort of cool. In 1963, a housewife in Chicago wrote a book about a problem without a name. Anybody know who that was? A problem without a name. Her name was Betty Friedan, and the name of the book was The Feminine Mystique, and it was a big thing. I thought, well, let's see how this moves along. And Betty Friedan, if you don't know, wrote this book, and then she became, I think, the leader of, maybe the president of the National Organization for Women. She was very involved in the Equal Rights Amendment, and so on and so on. And so I thought I'd take a look at that. So here is the word feminism. It wasn't a word for the most part up until about the early 60s, the time she wrote that book. And then you see all of a sudden feminism rises in society as a word, but as a concept, as a force, at least in language and certainly in other ways. And I said, well, what about civil rights? So I just put civil rights on top of there, and there you find a very similar kind of thing. The word civil rights wasn't around, and then all of a sudden it comes in the 50s, just as the civil rights movement happens, of course, and keeps on going up. So there you find a relationship between major social movements, if you will, and the way the language is going. So this takes me a little bit further, and here's liberty, which we already know. We're zooming back a little bit. There's liberty. There we're looking at, what are we looking at, 300 years? So let's take a look at science. All right, science is the red line. The word science really didn't even exist up until almost 1800. And the person, actually the word scientist was coined by a Cambridge philosopher by the name of William Whewell in 1833. And there's a terrific book on this written called Scientist, the Story of a Word. And so science comes up and it finds its feet. And the word environment, which I thought I'd throw in there, much, much later on, comes in sort of at the beginning of the 20th century and rises up and is still on the rise. Okay? Let's follow this a little bit further along. To add a little bit more, here's science again, rising up about 1800, still a very strong word in the language. I threw in evolution. So what happens with the word evolution? You see the yellow line there? It starts up, as you would expect, just about the time that Darwin publishes Origin of Species. Still, moving along. Environment, it is not as widely used as the word environment, because environment has many other kinds of meanings. But environment is a big word, and I thought let's put ecology in there. Ecology is still a faint force by comparison, but we're chugging along. And so there's that picture, looking at it that way. All right, let's turn a little bit of a corner here. And you all are reading the Paul Sears paper, or you will read the Paul Sears paper, which was an early paper on human ecology that he wrote in 1954. It's not long after being president of the Ecological Society of America. Paul Sears was the first chair of the conservation program, graduate conservation program at Yale. And he put it this way in another paper that he wrote. He said, "The ecological scientist climbs and climbs the mountain. And when he reaches the top, he finds the footprints of the poet." I love that. So, how did they get there? Where is the poet? Why do poets so often get where they're going before the scientists get there? If they met, would they try to talk to each other? And if they did, what might they produce in that conversation? For Sears, this was the core challenge, I think, of human ecology and its call for interdisciplinary integration and synthesis. Rachel Carson showed how to do it. Rachel Carson began her undergraduate studies really as a literature and poetry major, and when her favorite professor left, she decided to switch over to biology. And that's where she started to develop her interest in biology. In 1962, how many of you have seen or know of or have read Silent Spring? Okay, so that's still got currency. That came out in October of 1962. It was on the bestsellers, New York Times bestseller list, top of the bestsellers list for 84 weeks. Right? It was also adopted by Book of the Month Club, which is when I read it, and it was read by millions of people. So I thought that's worth a look. So here's the word conservation, the blue line. You see it cranking its way up through there, certainly through the period when Sears was at Yale and all the way on up and through. Actually, conservation is an important term all the way back into the early history of ecology, because one of the major things is whether ecology would be a pure science or whether it would be an applied science. And in that sense, it was around conservation. And then the pollution one really stands out, at least in my mind, is Rachel Carson publishes that book in '62. You just look at how fast awareness or consciousness of issues of pollution. And I would say that probably, if there's a threshold event, that was probably the threshold event that triggered the environmental movement of the late '60s. So Rachel Carson, I think, climbed the mountain as a scientist. But at the top, the footprints of the poet were her own. And if you haven't read Silent Spring, go back and look at it. It's filled with scientific stuff, and there's just a lot of data and a lot of carefully presented evidence in it. But that's not how it starts. It starts with an essay that she called A Fable for Tomorrow, where she talks about the future of the future and what it would be like if there were no birds. Silent Spring itself, the title is drawn from a poem by Keats. And that essay was a really important little piece of writing, because what it did was she did it in such a way that didn't scare people away from reading the scientific evidence. It invited them to want to read it. You know, and it's putting those things together that I think is the real art. This is the art that I think Bill Carpenter's trying to get us, get into our consciousness. So a little bit more of this, the graphs, and I'll wind this together. Here's evolution again, sort of focusing in. You see its rise, still growing in the language. There's conservation, sort of tracking along with it, and there's ecology. This is just zooming in a little bit closer to take a look at how these words are working these days, how these concepts are working. And I decided, well, why don't we put together, or what would happen if I put together ecology, civil rights, and feminism? And I think it's a curious instance. I won't say that these are correlated, except in terms of time, they are maybe related movements in certain kinds of ways, but they are of roughly equal proportion in terms of their presence in our consciousness and in our everyday language. Let's see if I go any further. Oh yeah, one other one here just to add on. There's ecology, rising from, say, the 30s to 2000, and starting to see the beginning of new ways for us to talk about the issues that are underneath ecology, at least the applied issues. That these may be the language terms that are doing what conservation did for a long time, or what pollution did for a long time, but they're of a different caliber. And so I thought it would be good to look at the words like climate change and global warming and sustainability. I think that's about as far as I want to go with that. And I want to sort of bring this to a little bit of a closure. And I'll use Bill Carpenter, because I just think his essay is really ahead of the curve in so many ways. And the people I'm pointing to here, pointing to Sears, I'm pointing to Rachel Carson and other kinds of people that somehow or other have figured out a way to bridge across the really big interdisciplinary gaps of bringing art and science and those kinds of things together. And I want to reread, you've read this probably, but I want to reread just the opening of Bill's essay, because I think it's a good way. If you ask a poet to write something, they usually come up with some kind of magic. And I don't know how well, none of you know Bill yet, I guess. He's on leave this term. He was the first faculty member here. And his background is in literature. And later on in life, he stopped being a straight academic literature person who studied somebody else's work and decided it was better to do his own. So he became a poet, and became a very good poet. And if you have a chance, read his poetry sometime. And he sort of worked through the poetry phase and then has become a novelist. And he's written a number of novels. And John just told me today, would this be okay to say? His last novel called The Wooden Nickel, which is about Maine. It's about Maine fishing. Do you guys know this book? Wooden Nickel, Bill's book? Apparently, the rights have just been purchased to turn it into a movie. But in addition to his ability to write, and to write in poetic language, Bill also is a top-of-the-line ornithologist. He's deeply knowledgeable of evolutionary biology, and he knows as much psychology in a number of areas, maybe more than I do. So he truly is an interdisciplinary person. And so here's the first paragraph of that. And you've read this, but I just like it. It says, "My father is a landscape painter, and as a child I used to go with him on watercolor expeditions on the Cape Cod sand dunes, where we spent our summers. One morning he sat down to paint a scene with 2 or 3 simple shore cottages and a large tree. As he began the work, I was horrified to see that he had moved one of the cottages in the picture so that it stood on the other side of the tree from where it really was. It shook my view of reality to the roots. Before I went out painting with him again, I bought a Brownie Hawkeye camera, and from then on, I photographed every scene he painted so there was at least some record of the truth." Now, why is that important? I mean, I'll tell you why it's important to me anyhow. Well, that's 5 sentences and 131 words. And what he has done in there is he has brought together the values, the truth values of science, the searching for the truth of what is, right up against the artistic values of and the aesthetic values of what could be. And he's done it, there it is, it's right there. And if you could follow through that, the rest of him is just sort of playing, but he set the stage in that little box. And you don't find many of those boxes around. So I appreciate that a great deal. Eric Kandel, I don't know how many people would know who he is. He got the Nobel Prize for his study of the physiology of memory. And he wrote a really interesting book a couple of years ago called In Search of Memory, which I use because he uses autobiography as a way to teach his life story of learning physiology. And he goes between a chapter in physiology and a chapter in his personal life and a chapter in things. In this bigger story form, he sort of teaches you physiology and teaches you a lot about history and all that sort of stuff. I like that book. And he says that there are certain scientists who live 2 lives. Some of them, and these are the scientists who can do what he calls day science and night science. And night science is when you go beyond just the sciencey part. And his own writing is an example of that kind of stuff. And we've all come across those kinds of people in different kinds of ways. I don't know how many of you, or maybe everybody knows, Anton Chekhov, the playwright, and the plays, was it Three Sisters and Uncle Vanya and the Cherry Orchard and stuff like that. Well, those are some of the most exquisite psychiatric descriptions of character studies and this is really early on, that are out there. Most people don't know that he was actually an MD. And his day job was as a physician. And as he said in his autobiography, my wife is medicine, my wife is science, my mistress is literature. And he worked back and forth between those things. And he's had that capacity to do all of that. William Carlos Williams, as a poet, if you know his work, he was also an MD, lived in those lives. Now, there are a lot of people like that. Those people really, really interest me. Isley is one of them. Rachel Carson that we've touched. I mean, certainly Carpenter is one of them. Lewis Thomas, if any of you know him, he was a very well-known, I don't know what all positions he held, but he was a distinguished scientist. But he wrote beautiful essays on this night. I think he dedicated them to Mahler. He wrote what are some of those books, John? The Medusa and the Snail. Yeah. And if you have a chance, I love to read little essays late at night. This is how I put myself to sleep. But if you have a chance to read some of these things, that's a kind of writing, that's a kind of way of thinking that is really expected. He was also, by the way, a trustee of the college. So another one of these people was René Dubos. If you haven't heard of him, he wrote a lot along these lines. René Dubos was also an early trustee of the college. And René Dubos, one thing I know you know that he did, he coined the phrase, think globally and act locally, which sort of had a little bit of stick to it. And there are many others along the way like this, including lately, if you've read any of Michael Pollan's stuff. He may not be poetic, but he's really good at getting on that inside ecological story and sort of you just can't look at your food the way you did before because he adds so much more story to it. And of course, the Sears and Shepard, at least in my mind, are other people along those lines. So to sum up, Shepard put it this way: the kind of thinking and synthesis which seems to me to fulfill the great promise of human ecology are not research reports, they are works of art. And I'm in a curious position right here, being the psychologist in between the scientist and next with Catherine, the artist. But I don't think he meant art as paintings on walls in museums. I think he really meant that the art that we need to develop more is the art that's around the actual landscapes and the cities and the modes of meaningful life that we create for ourselves. So that's what I want to bring into awareness. Thank you. Do we want to do any comments or questions or anything? Yes.
Can you talk in more detail maybe about how you have changed since or your thinking has changed since your piece in 1963? Like what in it would you maybe not think now?
Yeah, there's a number of things there. When I go back, and it's one of those things, you know, it's like old relationships you have with formal people. You say, gee, I wish I hadn't done that. But a couple of the things that really stand out in the difference. Back when I was writing that, I really believed the ecosystem concept. I really did. I really felt that nature was its own thing and that humans were messing it all up. That has completely changed in my thinking. And now I feel that, the world is a lot more complicated than I thought it was. But that doesn't make it less important, what would you say, morally, ethically. You know, that's a huge change. And that essay was actually done in a panel where I masked how I was really feeling, but I was in sort of a pissy mood in it because the PC computer had just been invented. Came out a couple of years before, and this was all a conference all about how wonderful technology was, and all that little stuff where I'm talking about drugs and too much sugar and all that stuff. What I was really saying is that these computers can take us into very bad places. And what I didn't know this would exist, but I was thinking I could easily see how people get themselves hypnotized by computers, and that's all they do, like video games or something. We're sort of doing that. And my interest was we got to turn the other way, and I was really worried where computers might take us. So I don't know if I was right or wrong, but that was partly why I was doing what I was doing there. Yeah. Back there? No? Anybody? Where? Yes.
So when we talk about human ecology as a perspective, as a way of seeing the world, we're also talking about a way in which you carry yourself in the world in general.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not sure if we also think that way or not. How do you act from that?
Yeah. I'm just saying, I'm stopping because I don't think I have a short answer to that. I do. I do believe in some kind of meaningfulness in life experience, and I really believe the world is there, and it has been there, and it's increasingly important to me to figure out how to have that experience of life. And when I'm going through this sort of stuff with my sister and going out there and really looking at a tree, not just as a tree that's standing here, but seeing somehow in time the connection of that. Oh, here's it is. In Isley's essay there, I think it's one of the later ones, How Natural is Human or something like that, where he's in a classroom with a student and the student says, Doctor, do you think life or evolution has direction or something? And all of a sudden he sees this face turn into a monkey, and then he sees this tail go down the steps and down through the door and down into the cellar and down underground and all that sort of stuff. And then he turns and he looks and he sees it happening to himself. I think I'm trying to really see the world that way. Does that make sense? That we really are connected to all of life and to each other. And so what does that do to you it stops you having this sort of narrow, selfish thing that we get into when all we do is try to go over to TJ Maxx by 5 o'clock or before the sale is over. You know, that sort of short, small life, I don't know, it just scares me. And so, yeah, I'm always sort of playing with my head in ways to get more in touch with its wonder. So, anything else? Yeah.
I wanted to ask this from the perspective of someone who has, well, you might know this term, NLD, nonverbal learning disorder.
Mm-hmm.
Where you talked about the power of language, and I want to spread it over into the power of stories as well.
Yeah.
How and why is it that stories have such a powerful long-term psychoactive response in people's head?
Yeah. Okay.
From the perspective of one from words are basically how he understands the world.
Terrific. That's a great question. I don't even know how far to go with that, but I'll give you a couple things that stick with me. I've always liked the ideas of Gregory Bateson. Now, Gregory Bateson drives some people absolutely crazy because his thinking is rather convoluted and on and on. But I've spent a lot of time swimming around in his pool trying to make sense out of it. And there is a little story that he tells. I don't know, it's not true. But it goes like this, and it's very short, that when one of the first big computers was developed, one of the big mainframes, some dignitary was brought in to see the new computer. And the computer people were all talking about how big it was and how all the things it could solve and stuff like that. And the guy says, "Can I ask the computer a question?" They say, "Sure, ask a question." And he says, "Ask the computer this question." He says, "Do you compute that you will ever think like a human being?" And the computer, all the tapes are spinning and the lights are going, and then all of a sudden the printer starts to print, and the guy walks over and there's a piece of paper coming out. He pulls off the piece of paper and he brings it back, and on the piece of paper it says this: "That reminds me of a story." Right? Now, that sounds like some cute little joke, but there's something really big in there. And if we had more time, I would pull out Aristotle and talk about the relationship between formal causes and final causes and all that sort of stuff. And if we really want to think about the relationship between physical causes and biological patterns, the stories that make a woodchuck and not just a bunch of chemicals, and the way in which story is imagined forward in time, that's big. Yeah, and I do think story is a core. We call it story. I don't just mean story, but I mean the thing that holds meaning together is really huge, and that may be the big invention that makes life and thought at all. Thank you. Yes. And was there someone back here? Gray, was it? Oh, I'm sorry. He asked me something about stories, right? Or at least that's what I heard. All right. Are there any other things? Thank you all.